What if the most American symbol in the world wasn't American at all? It began not with a torch, but with a whisper in the dark, in a place far from the bustling harbors of New York. Picture a Parisian workshop in the 1870s, the air thick with the smell of clay and coal smoke. Here, in the dim, flickering gaslight, a man named Frederick August Bartholdi is dreaming on a colossal scale. His hands work over a massive Fortin clay model, shaping a single finger, a fold of robe, a serene, almost alien face. This isn't just a sculpture, it is an obsession. He calls it liberty enlightening the world, but it is a goddess without a home, a solution in search of a problem. The problem, it turned out, was a fractured friendship. America was reeling, still tender from the Civil War's brutal scars. And in France, a nation that had bled with the colonists for their freedom, a group of intellectuals, including Bartholdi and a man named Édouard de la Boulaye, conceived of a monumental gift, a testament to the enduring ideals of liberty and republic, a beacon for the world. But the idea was immense, unprecedented. And America, they were told, would have to provide the pedestal. The statue itself would be a gift, but the ground upon which it stood, that was an American responsibility. 4 years, the dream languished. Bartholdi, a showman as much as a sculptor, built the arm. The torch-bearing forearm, a terrifying and beautiful thing, was shipped to the United States for the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It was a marketing stunt of epic proportions. For 50 cents, visitors could climb a ladder inside the arm and stand on the torch balcony, looking out over the fairgrounds. They stood in the hand of a goddess they had never seen, a promise cast in copper and iron. But back in France, the rest of her body was a skeleton, slowly being skinned. The brilliant engineer Gustave Eiffel that Eiffel hired to design the internal framework, a revolutionary structure of iron pylons and a secondary skeleton that would allow the copper skin to move and sway in the harbor winds, to expand and contract with the brutal New York seasons. She was to be a living structure, not a rigid idol. Meanwhile, in America, a different battle was being fought. The fundraising for the pedestal was a disaster. The public was indifferent. Politicians, scornful. The New York Times called it a gift from the people of France of a colossal statue of a female, which is to be elevated on a pedestal, the cost of which is to be borne by the people of this country. They made it sound like a frivolous, expensive burden. The project stalled. The completed pieces of the statue of the head, the torso, sections of robe were piling up in a Parisian warehouse. A dismembered giantess waiting for a call that might never come. The entire vision was on the brink of collapse, a beautiful, impossible dream about to be sold for scrap, until one man decided to wield the most powerful weapon he had. His pen? Joseph Puritan, the pugnacious, Hungarian-born publisher of the New York World, took up the cause. He was a man who understood the power of the people, of the collective will. He launched a crusade in his newspaper, shaming the millionaires who wouldn't donate and appealing directly to the working class, to the shopkeepers, the street sweepers. He promised to print the name of every single person who contributed, no matter how small the donation, and the people listened. Dimes and quarters flooded the world's offices. Over 120,000 people gave, most of them less than $1. This was not a statue funded by tycoons. It was being built by the masses. For the masses, the final $100,000 was raised in a matter of months. The pedestal, designed by the American architect Richard Morse Hunt, could finally rise from the mud of Ellis Island. Now, the pieces could cross the ocean. In the spring of 1885, the French steamer *Isser, overloaded and looking like it carried the dismantled parts of a mythical beast, fought its way through tempestuous Atlantic storms. 214 crates containing 350 individual pieces of copper and iron were packed in the hold. The journey was perilous. At times, it seemed the ocean itself might claim the gift before it ever reached its destination. But in June 1885, the *Isser sailed into New York Harbor, greeted by a flotilla of cheering boats and a city finally, truly captivated. The disassembled Liberty was stored on the island, and the painstaking work of reassembly began. It was a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of unimaginable scale. Workers, balanced on precarious scaffolding, riveted the copper skin to Eiffel's iron skeleton. The air rang with the sound of hammers, a metallic symphony building a giant. And then, the day arrived. October 28th, 1886. A day of relentless, chilling rain and a thick, soupy fog. The harbor was a chaos of boats, a fleet of steamers and yachts packed with spectators. Their whistles blaring, creating a deafening, ghostly chorus in the mist. The decks were a sea of black umbrellas. On Bedloe's Island, a select crowd of dignitaries, almost all men, stood in their sodden formal wear. The statue itself was hidden, a colossal secret veiled by the weather. The ceremony was a mess of mud and damp speeches. President Grover Cleveland, the man who, as governor of New York, had once vetoed a bill to fund the pedestal, now stood to accept the gift. "We will not forget that Liberty has here made her home," he intoned, the words struggling to carry over the wind and the distant boat horns. But the crowd wasn't there for the speeches. They were there for the reveal. As the final words were spoken, a signal was given. High above, a lone figure, Bartholdi himself, climbed the narrow, dark ladder inside the statue's arm. He had waited 17 years for this moment. From a small window in the torch, he looked down at the shrouded island, the gray harbor, the expectant world below. He was given the signal. With a heave, he pulled a rope, and a massive French tricolor flag that had been draped over the statue's face fell away. There was no grand, sunlit unveiling. The fog and rain did not part. But as the flag slipped down, a slow, rolling gasp moved through the fleet of ships. It was a sound of pure awe, swallowed by the fog but felt by everyone. There she was. Her stern, classical face, with the seven-rayed crown upon her head, stared not at the crowd on the island, but outwards, towards the open sea, the Atlantic she had just crossed. In her right hand, she raised the golden torch high into the weeping sky. In her left, she clutched the tabula ansodis, a tablet inscribed with the date of American independence. At her feet lay a broken chain and shackle, half hidden by her robes, a deliberate, powerful statement completed just after the Civil War. This was not just a symbol of liberty, but of emancipation. The celebration began. A fireworks display was attempted, fizzling pathetically in the damp air. The boats continued their frantic tooting, but for many, the most profound moment was a silent one. It was when the clouds briefly thinned, and a single, weak shaft of afternoon light struck the gilded flame. It flared, a sudden, blinding beacon in the gloom. In that instant, the statue was transformed from a sculpture into a symbol. She was no longer French copper or American iron. She was something new. She was a promise of refuge, of a second chance, of a light held against the darkness. But as the crowds eventually dispersed and the harbor fell quiet, a new silence settled around the colossal green figure. The celebrations were over. The work was done. Yet, the most important chapter of her story was only just beginning, for she now stood guard, a silent sentinel facing the vast, empty ocean. And the question hanging in the salt air, a question no one had truly asked yet, was a simple one. Who was she really waiting for? For 17 years, she had been a dream in a Parisian workshop. Now, she was a reality, standing 305 feet tall in the relentless salt wind. But in the days and weeks that followed that rain-soaked dedication, a strange emptiness settled over Bedloe's Island. The workmen were gone. The dignitaries had returned to their mansions. The steamers no longer crowded the harbor. The Statue of Liberty was alone, a colossal queen without subjects, a beacon without a beam. Her torch, gilded in gold leaf, was merely for show. It contained no real light. She was a promise, but in the silence, it felt like a promise waiting to be broken. Who was she waiting for? The answer, it turned out, was already on the water. They came first as specks on the horizon, their sails patched and weary. They were the Great Migration, The huddled masses the poet Emma Lazarus had written of just a few years earlier. Her words, for now, just a sonnet tucked away in a fundraising portfolio, not yet etched into the statue's very soul. These were steamers and sailing ships from Naples and Hamburg, from Rotterdam and Liverpool. And aboard them, crammed into steerage decks that stank of bilge and humanity, were people from a world away. Peasants from Sicily, their hands calloused from fields they would never see again. Stonemasons from Ireland, fleeing the ghost of famine. Tailors from Russian shtetls, fleeing the thunder of Their journey was a trial by water and fear, weeks of storms, sickness, and a profound, gnawing uncertainty. For them, the first sight of land was not the statue. It was the low, green sweep of Long Island, or the distant hills of Staten Island. Hope would flutter, a frantic bird in their chests. They would crowd the rails, their few worldly possessions clutched in sacks. And then, the ship would make its final turn into the Narrows, the gateway to New York Harbor. And they would see her. She was like nothing they had ever seen. A giant green woman. Her face not warm, not welcoming, but impossibly calm and resolute. She held her torch aloft, not in celebration, but in defiance. Defiance of the storms they had endured, of the tyrants they had fled, of the fear that still coiled in their stomachs. She did not smile. She offered a challenge. A silent question was etched into her copper features. Are you ready? This was the emotional chasm between the symbol and the symbolized. For the Americans on the mainland, she was an emblem of their perfected republic. For the arrivals, she was a terrifying and glorious threshold. Their arrival was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of its most brutal leg. Their ships did not dock at the island. They sailed past her, close enough to see the details of her rivets, the stern set of her mouth, and they continued a mile further into the harbor to a cluster of buildings on Ellis Island. And here, the narrative of liberty met the messy, often cruel, machinery of bureaucracy. The air in the great hall of Ellis Island was a cacophony of 1,000 languages, all rising in a cloud of anxiety. Doctors in military uniforms moved through the lines, chalking letters on the coats of those who failed their swift, terrifying inspections. An X for suspected mental defect. An E for eye disease. An L for lameness. Families clung to each other, watching for the chalk marks of doom that could tear them apart. This was the real test. The statue they had just passed was the ideal. This hole was the reality. It was a place of hope, but also of heartbreak, where the American dream was granted or denied by a stranger's mark. And through it all, Liberty stood sentinel, her back turned to Ellis Island. The arrivals could see her through the windows, a constant, silent witness to their ordeal. She became a totem, a good luck charm. To see her was to know they had arrived. To pass the inspections was to earn the right to sail back past her, towards the mythic skyline of Manhattan. For those who were rejected, condemned to return on the very ship that had brought them, her receding form was the last, cruel sight of a promise they would never touch. Meanwhile, the statue herself was changing. The gleaming copper that had arrived from France was already reacting to the harbor air. It was turning from a bright penny brown to a dull brown, and then, slowly, to the iconic verdigris sea green patina that acted as a protective skin. The public hated it. They wanted their golden goddess back. Newspapers decried the ugly stain, and there were even calls to scrub her clean, to paint her, to restore her to her original shine. They didn't understand that this transformation was not a decay, but a preservation. The patina was shielding the copper from the elements, ensuring she would endure for centuries. It was a powerful, unspoken metaphor. The ideal of liberty itself was not a static, polished thing. It had to change, to adapt, to develop a thick skin, to survive in a harsh world. Then, the world went dark. The First World War erupted in Europe, and the great migration of ships across the Atlantic slowed to a trickle of fear, replaced by troop ships and vessels of war. As a security measure, the statue's torch was dimmed, and the great lamp that had finally been installed within it was extinguished. For the first time since her dedication, her light was gone. It was a profound and symbolic blackout. It felt as if liberty itself had been put on hold. On the evening of April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress to ask for a declaration of war. That very night, a group of Army engineers secretly climbed the statue's double helix staircase. They didn't relight the torch. Instead, they switched on a single, powerful arc lamp, positioned at her feet, pointing upwards. It was a desperate, makeshift solution. The effect was ghostly, terrifying. The light illuminated her from below, casting deep, dramatic shadows across her face, making her look less like a benevolent goddess and more like a vengeance spirit rising from the harbor. It was a light not of welcome, but of warning. A signal that America and the ideal it housed was now awake, and it was armed. The war ended. The light was restored. The immigrants returned, their numbers swelling into a mighty river of humanity. And it was in this new century, in the wake of such global turmoil, that the statue finally found her voice. It wasn't in a speech or a decree. It was in a poem. Emma Lazarus's forgotten sonnet, The New Colossus, was rediscovered. In 1903, a bronze plaque bearing her words was affixed to the inner wall of the pedestal. But it was in the 1920s and 30s, as the statue became the definitive image of America for millions, that the words fused with the icon. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, ... The words gave meaning to the stone and copper. They explained her stern gaze. She was not looking out to sea out of indifference to those arriving. She was looking for them. She was waiting for them. Her torch was a guide, not for the comfortable, but for the desperate. She was the mother of exiles, and her embrace was the entire, chaotic, unforgiving, and magnificent country that lay beyond her shoulder. By the 1950s, her image was everywhere. A symbol of American triumph in a Second World War and a beacon against the new looming shadow of the Cold War. She had been sanitized, made safe for consumption, but her true power still resided in the personal, private moments of arrival. An old woman from Poland, her head covered in a scarf, pointing a trembling finger at the Green Giantess as her grandchildren, born in Brooklyn, looked on, unable to fully comprehend the journey she was describing. A Cuban refugee on a freedom flight, peering down from an airplane window and seeing her tiny form in the harbor, knowing his life was about to begin again. She had witnessed the closure of Ellis Island in 1954, her purpose seemingly complete. She stood through hurricanes and blackouts, through celebrations and protests. She was no longer just a gift from France. She was a part of the American landscape, as natural as the Hudson River. But her meaning was about to be tested once more. Not by the elements, but by the very people she was built to represent. For as the 20th century waned, a new question began to be whispered. A question that would challenge her very identity and force a nation to look into her green, impassive face and ask not who she was waiting for, but if the promise she held was still alive. The whisper began not as a shout, but as a slow, creeping corrosion, much like the patina on the copper itself. It started in the 1960s and gathered force through the 70s and 80s. The America that looked upon the statue was no longer the same nation that had welcomed her. It was a country grappling with civil rights, with Vietnam, with Watergate, with deep, systemic inequalities. The gleaming narrative of a flawless republic had tarnished. And so, the statue's meaning began to fracture. For some, she remained the mother of exiles. For others, she became a symbol of hypocrisy, a bronze punchline to a joke about the American dream. How could she speak of welcoming the tired and poor when the gates were slamming shut? How could she promise freedom when so many within her shadow were still fighting for it? This conflict was no longer an external one, fought against storms or engineering challenges. It was an internal, spiritual, civil war over the statue's very soul. And the statue herself began to show the strain of this national dissonance. A century of salt spray and pollution had taken its toll. The iron armature, designed by Eiffel, was rusting, its slow bleed staining the copper from the inside out. The torch, leaking and structurally weak, had been closed to the public since 1916 after a catastrophic explosion on a nearby island act of German sabotage had damaged it. She was literally crumbling under the weight of her own symbolism. Then, in 1982, President Ronald Reagan announced it. The Statue of Liberty was dying. She needed to be saved. A massive restoration project, a private sector undertaking worthy of Pulitzer himself, was launched. It was framed as a national act of renewal, a rededication of America's core values. But as the scaffolding rose around her, encasing her in a metal cocoon, it felt like something more profound. It was as if the nation was putting its own conscience in a cast, forcing itself to look at the damage and decide what to repair and what to discard. The restoration was an archaeological dig into the American psyche. Workers discovered shocking truths hidden for a century. The original torch, they found, had been botched in its first installation by the American workmen. Bartholdi's design had been compromised, its windows cut incorrectly, leading to the leaks and weakness. It was a revelation that held a mirror to the entire enterprise. The grand gift from France had been imperfectly assembled by its recipients from the very start. The promise had been flawed in its execution. The most heated debate centered on the torch. It was too damaged to save. Should they rebuild it exactly as it was? Or should they correct the original error, fulfilling Bartholdi's true vision? The decision was made for brutal honesty. The original torch was carefully removed and placed in the museum, a relic of a flawed past. A new, perfectly replicated torch was built, but with one critical, heartbreaking change. They gold-leafed it not with 24-karat gold, but with a thinner, less reflective layer. It would never shine with the same blinding brilliance as the one that had greeted the immigrants. The new light would be softer, more muted, a symbol of a more sober, less naive hope. On July 3rd, 1986, for her centennial celebration, the scaffolding came down. The world saw a repaired, revitalized statue, but something was different. The light was different. She was clean, but the verdigris, the protective skin born of hardship, remained. The nation celebrated with a spectacular display of fireworks, a flotilla of tall ships, and a sense of triumphant patriotism. But the restoration had exposed a nerve. The process had revealed that the statue was not a timeless, immutable icon. She was a physical object shaped by human hands and subject to human error and revision. She could be taken apart and put back together. Her meaning was not fixed in copper, but was as fluid as the water around her. The world that emerged after 1986 was new. The Cold War ended. The digital age dawned. Ellis Island became a museum of memory, not a functioning gateway. The great waves of immigration continued, but they were different, more global, more complex. The statue was now a backdrop for tourist selfies, her image reproduced on everything from postcards to protest signs. She was a global brand, and in becoming ubiquitous, she risked becoming empty. Then, on a bright, terrible Tuesday morning in September 2001, the world shifted on its axis. As smoke poured from the Twin Towers across the harbor, a new, terrifying silence fell. All air traffic was grounded. All boats were stopped. For the first time in over a century, the harbor was utterly still. And in that stillness, the statue stood, facing a plume of smoke where the skyline had been. The attack was an assault on the very ideals of openness and freedom she represented. In the days that followed, a strange, powerful image began to circulate. A photograph, taken from the ruins, showed Lady Liberty seemingly unscathed, standing resolute through the haze. The image was a comfort, a declaration that she had survived. But the nature of her survival had changed. Security checkpoints and fences sprouted on her island. The climb to a crown, once a rite of passage, was closed for years. The light of liberty now had to be guarded, protected from a new kind of storm. This was the turning point, the moment the central mystery of her existence transformed. The question was no longer, who is she waiting for? The new, more urgent, and more painful question became, what has she become? Is she a monument to a bygone era of optimistic welcome, a beautiful, obsolete relic, or is she a mirror, reflecting back whatever a fractured, anxious America projects onto her green, impassive face? She holds her tablet, inscribed with July the 4th, MDCCL, XXVI, a date marking a revolution. But the shackles at her feet, the broken chain of emancipation, now seemed to ask a revolution of a different kind. The torch still burns, but its light now falls on a nation and a world grappling with borders, with fear, with the very meaning of the words she was built to embody. And as the sun sets, casting her long shadow across the harbor, the most unsettling realization of all begins to dawn. Her work is not finished. It has only just begun. The 21st century did not bring answers, but it amplified the questions. The statue stood as the world digitized around her, her image pixelated and shared 1 billion times, a symbol so ubiquitous it was in danger of becoming invisible. Then, the storms came. Not just meteorological ones. Though Hurricane Sandy in 2012 sent a tidal surge through her island, flooding the infrastructure and closing her for a year, a stark reminder of a new, more fragile world. The real storm was a human one. A new generation now looked up at her, their faces illuminated, not by her torch, but by the glow of their phones, scrolling through a feed of history's sins. They saw the cracks the restoration couldn't fix. They saw the shackles at her feet and asked why chains had ever existed in the land of the free. They heard the words huddled massus and saw policies that turned away the tired, the poor, the tempest-tossed at the border. The statue became the ultimate Rorschach test. For some, she was a timeless ideal to be defended. For others, she was a monument to a promise never kept, a lie in green copper. The debate was no longer academic. It was visceral, echoing in the shouts of protests and the silent, aching divisions at family dinner tables. The pressure was building, not just on her symbolic shoulders, but within her very structure. Engineers monitoring her frame detected a slight, almost imperceptible shift. The constant, gentle sway she was designed for was being tested by stronger, more frequent storms. The new torch, for all its technical perfection, seemed to burn with an anxious energy. The air around the island grew thick with unspoken tension. It felt as if the collective weight of the nation's unresolved conflict was pressing down on Bedloe's Island, a geological pressure of the soul. Then, a spark. A controversial executive order. A viral video of a child separated from a parent at a port of entry. The statue's image was weaponized by both sides. She was photoshopped crying tears of rust. She was depicted turning her back on the harbor. She was shown snapping her tablet in two. The abstract debate had found its terrible, specific focus. The air crackled with a coming fury. One evening, as a deep orange sun bled into the New Jersey horizon, two figures stood at the railing of the ferry. One was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his posture bent from a lifetime of labor. He had come here as a boy, had passed through Ellis Island, had seen her from the rail of a ship. She was his personal saint. The other was his granddaughter, a young woman with fierce eyes and a knot of anger in her jaw. She saw a monument to selective memory. "They should tear it down," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried on the wind like a shard of glass. "Or put a plaque next to it. A big one that lists all the people she failed, all the promises broken." The old man didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the statue, now silhouetted against the dying light. "No," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "You don't understand? She is not the promise." The girl turned, ready for an argument. "Then what is she?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound, the churning of the ferry's wake and the distant, lonely cry of a gull. "The light," he finally said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean in. "It is not the shore. It does not tell you the shore is safe. It only tells you the rocks are there. The journey is not over when you see the light. The journey is just beginning. She is not the answer. She is the question." His words hung in the salt air. A new thought, a fragile thread in the gathering storm. The granddaughter looked back at the statue, and for the first time, she didn't see a statement. She saw an interrogation. That stern, unblinking gaze was not judging her. It was asking her, demanding of her, "What will you do?" As darkness fully embraced the harbor, the spotlights ignited, bathing Liberty in a cold, brilliant white. She glowed, unnaturally bright against the black sky, a phantom. The wind picked up, whistling through the spikes of her crown, creating an eerie, almost melodic hum. It was the sound of a blade being sharpened. Down the old footwalls of a pedestal, a National Park Service ranger, making her final rounds, paused. She placed a hand against the cold, granite inner wall. She could feel a vibration, a deep, resonant thrum that was more than the generators, more than the distant city. It was as if the iron heart of the statue itself was beating, pounding with a rhythm of gathering urgency. High above, at the very tip of the torch, a single, worn copper seam, stressed by a century of wind and the new, unnatural pressures of a heated world, began to groan. It was a sound no human could hear, a metallic sigh of fatigue. A microscopic crack, invisible to any drone's camera, began to propagate. It inched its way through the metal, a tiny, inevitable fault line spreading through the symbol of the ideal. The light it held flickered for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible stutter in the relentless glare. It was a warning. The storm wasn't coming from the outside. It was here. And the statue, the mirror, the question made of metal, could no longer simply bear witness. She was beginning to react. The groan became a shriek, a high-pitched tearing of metal that cut through the hum of the spotlights and the distant city. High atop the torch, the microscopic crack surrendered to a century of accumulated stress. With a sound like a cannon shot, a single, massive sheet of copper, shaped like a giant teardrop, peeled away from the golden flame. It twisted in the air, a shard of broken promise catching the artificial light, and began its long, tumbling fall towards the water. On the ferry below, the gasp was a collective, physical blow. The old man's hand shot out, gripping his granddaughter's arm. Her argument, her anger, vanished, replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching horror. It was not a symbol breaking, it was a part of the sky falling. The copper sheet did not crash onto the island or the pedestal. It cartwheeled a glittering, doomed projectile and struck the dark water of the harbor with a colossal, sickening slap. The sound echoed off the skyscrapers of Manhattan, a final, reverberating note of fracture. A geyser of white water erupted, then subsided, leaving behind only a patch of churning, restless foam. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The statue stood, wounded, a gaping, black maw torn into the side of her torch. The perfect, iconic silhouette was now broken. A piece of her was gone. Then, chaos! Sirens wailed from the island. Security boats roared to life, their searchlights sweeping the black water. News helicopters, drawn like vultures to the sound, thumped in the night sky, their beams converging on the wounded giant. The image flashed around the globe in seconds. Liberty damaged. Torch breaks. Symbol falls. But on the ferry, frozen at the railing, the old man and the young woman were not watching the news feeds. They were staring at the statue itself. And they saw it. With the outer skin of the torch torn open, the interior was exposed. There, cradled within the steel armature, was the original colossal litha, one installed during the 1986 restoration. It was not a soft, muted glow. It was a blinding, pure, incandescent white, a captured star. The broken copper had been a veil, and now that veil was torn. The true light, harsh and unforgiving and magnificent, now blazed out across the harbor unimpeded. It was a light that did not welcome or comfort. It revealed. It lit up the rust streaks on her robe with brutal clarity. It illuminated the repaired seams on her face, the scars of her own history. It shone directly onto the broken chain at her feet, making the metal gleam as if newly forged. It was a light that showed everything, hid nothing. The perfect and the flawed, the ideal and the reality were simultaneously, brutally exposed. The granddaughter finally understood. Her grandfather's words were not a defense of the statue. They were a key. The statue was not a finished ideal. She was a chronicle. Her green skin was the patina of time and trial. Her broken torch was a testament to fragility. Her light was not the warm hearth of a promise fulfilled. but the searing glare of truth. It was a light meant to illuminate the rocks, yes, but also to expose the flaws in the ship, the fear in the sailor's heart. On the island, rangers and engineers were scrambling, their voices sharp with panic and protocol. But the world watching felt a different emotion, a strange, collective catharsis. The symbol had not been destroyed. It had been made honest. The pressure that had been building for decades had not shattered her. It had cracked her open. The old man let out a long, slow breath, his grip on his granddaughter's arm softening. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved, as if a fever had broken. "You see," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind and the sirens. "She is not breaking. She is becoming. She is showing us what she has always been." The granddaughter looked from the blinding, exposed light back to the dark, restless water where the piece of copper had vanished. It was not a loss. It was a shedding. A letting go of a polished, gilded lie. The statue, in her wounded state, was more powerful than she had ever been. She was no longer just a question. She was an answer, the only one she could ever give. That liberty is not a destination, a pristine shore. It is a vessel, constantly being repaired, battered by storms, and navigated by flawed, courageous hands. And its light is not for looking at, but for seeing by. The torch was broken, but the light, at last, was free. In the days that followed, the harbor felt different. The air, once thick with symbolic weight, had been cleared by the shock of the fracture. The frantic news cycles eventually moved on, but the image of the statue, wounded yet resolute, her true light blazing, was seared into the national consciousness. She was closed to the public, encircled once more by scaffolding not for restoration, but for This time, the work was quieter, more thoughtful. The question was no longer how to restore her to a past ideal, but how to honor what she had revealed about herself. The piece of the torch was never recovered. It had sunk deep into the harbor mud, a relic for some future generation to discover. And in its loss, there was a strange perfection. The statue was now physically marked by the very passage of time and conflict she had witnessed. She was no longer separate from history. She was a document of it, her scar as much a part of her as her serene gaze. The old man and his granddaughter returned to the ferry one, still mourning. Weeks later, the silence between them was no longer charged with argument, but filled with a shared understanding. The scaffolding was a delicate web around the torch, and engineers could be seen as tiny specks against the brilliant, exposed light, which still shone day and night. It had been decided it would remain exposed, the broken edges of copper stabilized and preserved, not hidden. "They're not going to fix it," the granddaughter said, her voice soft with awe. "They are fixing it," her grandfather corrected gently. "They are fixing it by letting it be true." He pointed a trembling finger not at the statue, but at the water around her. The morning sun glinted off the surface, and in the wake of a passing barge, something caught the light. A small, flickering reflection of the statue's new, raw light danced on the waves. Then another and another. She was broken, and now her light was everywhere, fractured into 1,000 pieces on the moving water. Each one a tiny, shimmering echo of the whole. He had been right all along. She was not the promise. She was the light held against the storm. And a light is not meant to be perfect and unchanging. It is meant to burn, to guide, to reveal the way, even especially when it reveals the damage. The promise was not in her unbroken form. It was in her enduring presence. It was in the fact that after the fracture, she was still there. The light had not been extinguished. It had been unleashed. The final, quiet mystery of the Statue of Liberty is not who she was waiting for or what she has become. It is the question she now silently asks every one of us who looks upon her, whole or broken. It is the same question she asked the immigrant, the orphan, the refugee, the tycoon, and the protester. A question that does not demand an easy answer, but requires a lifelong response. Now that you have seen the light, what will you do with it? The harbor endures. The skyline changes. the world turns. And she remains, not as a symbol of a perfect union, but as a guardian of the perpetual, struggling, and beautiful effort to form one. Her back is to the city, her face to the endless ocean of possibility and peril. She is not a destination. She is a direction. And the journey continues.